Kirby Smart says his program will not be complacent, and he gives the reason why in this quote when he was talking to ESPN. He says, the question is, what's the secret to not getting complacent after playing for or winning the SEC or national title 6 of the last 7 seasons? He says, it's like elasticity. Now, if y'all don't know what that is, he goes on to explain it right here. He says, if you have a rubber band and you keep stretching it and you stretch it and you stretch it, eventually it loses its construction and it's just loose. I tell our guys all the time, we are going to stretch you every day where you're really where you're really comfortable being uncomfortable. We're really going to make you uncomfortable, or we're going to make you uncomfortable at practice. Guys come up to me and they tell me they can't make it through practice. Our practices are more intense than games, and that's purposeful because I feel it gives our team the ability to sustain the season. To get up for every game, you have to get up for every practice. If you don't, that's what you get. That's when you get your ass beat. And I talked about that that specific quote, of which I am a big believer in, a couple of nights ago. You can look at that on the thread here. But sustaining excellence is difficult to do, and that's why what Nick did at Alabama was so impressive. Georgia can do something very similar to that over this 10-year stretch. If you start the 10 years at the year 2020 or 2001, that would be not dissimilar from starting it at Alabama in 08. And obviously Nick won 6 national championships from 09 to 2020. So in 11 years, he won 6 national championships, if I'm not mistaken. I could be getting the math wrong. 9, 11, 12, 15, 17, 20. So all those national championships, 6 national championships, y'all, in an 11-year stretch. That's amazing. I mean, that would mean for Georgia, they need to win 4 more over the next, until 2031. I mean, I think that's completely possible. And I don't know if it's probable because we don't know what the future will look like in terms of everything. But if college football essentially stays the way that it is now, which it won't, then yeah, I would say Georgia would be in very good shape to possibly accomplish that. But the practice part is what's so critical here. Y'all don't see practices, and that's fine. And we only see a limited amount of it. We certainly hear some of it, but the guys, it's just a consistent theme over the years. Guys explaining how much difficult practice is than games, how much more difficult. Look, the games are often not real tough for Georgia, and it depends on the game. It depends, Auburn and South Carolina this past season, those were tough games. Alabama, I'm trying to think of other games that were tough. Not Ole Miss, not Tennessee. Georgia Tech a little bit, but not really. Vanderbilt by the same measure as Vanderbilt and Tech in the same sort of universe. But they do make practices very difficult. And NFL folks say all the time that that's the program that has guys the most ready to play in the NFL. And it's because of the practices. Now, NFL practices and college practices are not at all the same, believe me. But the practices at Georgia prepare those guys for the NFL. And when you look forward over these next few years, Georgia, I mean, they're the favorite to win the national championship this season, and there's a reason why. They're the best team. They're returning a lot of parts. Ohio State is the very clear threat, and Texas is pretty seriously a threat as well. When you think about how can they get elasticity in practice? How can they stretch these guys out? How can they make it harder when, all they've done essentially these last 3 years for sure, but even longer than that is win. It's what they're doing. It's making things very difficult during practice. You think about it this way too. Georgia's practices, usually the guys they play, those are the best players they're going to see that week. Usually. Now, not every single time, and it depends on the situation. It depends on a few things. But generally speaking, the best player that Tate Ratledge is going to go up against that week is probably Nazir Stackhouse or someone from Georgia's offensive line. It's not every time. It's not every time. I am just, by the way, looking at some of these lines for the future, and they are very. I mean, Ohio State is a 9.5 point favorite over Michigan at home. Georgia is a 3.5 over Alabama on the road, which is very curious. That means they'd be probably a 7.5, 8.5 point favorite in Athens, but they don't play it there. I just got a new set of double dogs in. It talks about Georgia winning the national championship and everything that went into it. Chronicles the season, gives behind the scenes look. If you've not bought it, just buy it for the Ohio State game alone. The article about that, or the story about that, Double Dogs is available right down below. It's also available only there down below, or only at Red Zone in Athens. G-Day's coming up. You're going to want to make sure that you've got your everything set in terms of where you're shopping when you go into town. There's only one place to shop. You cannot miss Red Zone. If you're doing that, you're doing yourself a disservice. The practices at Georgia are intense, serious. They're developmental. They are important for the future of this players, as well as that moment in time. Again, the quote: if you have a rubber band and you keep, I'm not going to go there. We're going to stretch you every day to where you're really comfortable being uncomfortable. We're going to make you uncomfortable at practice. So speaking of the South Carolina game from a season ago, and Georgia won't play South Carolina until 2026 unless they meet up in the SEC championship game or in the playoffs. If you remember that game, and what was so informative was the behind-the-scenes look from the SEC for Georgia, South Carolina. Javon Bullard, Carson Beck, there was no fear. There was no concern. They knew they could win that game. They knew they would win that game. They weren't panicking, but they also weren't not taking it seriously. They were exactly where they needed to be. You don't get to that place without having gone through it a few times. And there's only Carson Beck had never been in that situation before, which means that he had seen that in practice a lot. And I think that's why they win. I think their practices are the reason they win. It's the combination of the recruiting and the practices. It's not the crowd at Sanford. It's not the jerseys. It's not that. Other teams have really good players too, typically. Or you don't play well that day, or there can be any number of things that can happen or whatever. They're used to the struggle. They're used to having to fight their way through a practice. I've never practiced at Georgia, so I can't say what that's like. I know what it was like for us at our, our basketball practices were abnormally physical. They were rougher than football, from my experience. They were rougher than football. And that got you ready for the practices were harder than the games. But I think at Georgia it's a whole nother level. I think it's a whole nother level, comparatively speaking, to the skill set they've got, the guys, and the expectations, etc. There's not a lot of, you can't really talk about South Carolina and Georgia in the same universe because they're not. But like Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, LSU, I guess to some degree, teams that are playing well, you've got to do it in practice. You've got to mentally prepare your guys. And the only real way, I guess, is to run them down physically. And I don't mean screaming and yelling at them. I mean to test their bodies to the absolute where they will go, and then pushing them mentally to be able to say, if something bad happens, it's irrelevant. We're on to the next thing. That is easy to say. That is not easy to do. But I've seen it so many times with this team and this program. At Tennessee in 2021, JT Daniels getting hurt. Down to Alabama in the third quarter, late in the national championship game. This season, I've seen it too many times. They know what they're doing. They've done this. There's a way to do it, and they're doing it. And it's not surprising that they are not complacent because they are practicing that out of their program and it's working.